The morning sun filtered through the soaring glass panels of the pearl atrium, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished white marble floor. It was the kind of space that smelled of expensive espresso beans and filtered air, a sanctuary for the city's elite to conduct million-dollar deals over oat milk lattes. Kenji Chen sat in a corner booth, feeling like a smudge of gray on a pristine canvas. He adjusted his worn-out hoodie, trying to hide the frayed cuffs, and pulled his stained canvas bag closer to his feet. He hadn't slept in 36 hours, his eyes red-rimmed from staring at the complex architectural blueprints flickering on his cracked laptop screen. To anyone passing by, he looked like a man who had wandered in by mistake, a ghost haunting a temple of wealth. Across the lounge, the heavy glass doors swung open, and the atmosphere seemed to shift instantly. Beatrice Vanderhouse marched in, her 6-inch stiletto heels clicking against the stone like a metronome of pure arrogance. She was draped in a tailored white blazer that probably cost more than most people made in a year, her eyes hidden behind oversized designer sunglasses. She didn't walk, she colonized the room. Behind the counter, Marcus, a young barista with shaky hands, immediately straightened his apron. He knew Beatrice. Everyone knew Beatrice. She was the golden girl of marketing, a woman whose social media feed was a curated lie of perfection and whose real-life personality was a serrated blade. Beatrice was deep into a phone call, her voice loud and sharp as she barked orders at a subordinate. She wasn't looking down, she was looking at her own reflection in the polished surfaces of the atrium. As she swept past the corner booth, the toe of her designer pump caught on the strap of Kenji's canvas bag, which was tucked neatly beneath his chair. The trip was minor, a mere stumble, but to Beatrice, it was a personal affront to her dignity. She jerked her foot back, nearly dropping her phone, and turned on Kenji with the speed of a striking viper. The silence that followed was deafening. Beatrice didn't just look at Kenji, she looked through him, her face contorting into a mask of pure disgust. She didn't ask him to move the bag. She didn't wait for an apology. Instead, she let out a sharp, jagged laugh that drew every eye in the lounge. She looked at Kenji's hoodie, his tired face, and the blueprints on his screen, and she decided exactly who he was. To her, he was trash that had been blown in by a gust of wind, an eyesore ruining the aesthetic of her professional kingdom. Kenji looked up, blinking slowly against the fatigue. He began to reach for his bag to pull it even further back, his voice quiet and level. He told her he was sorry she tripped and that he was just finishing his work. But Beatrice wasn't listening. She took a step closer, the scent of her cloying, expensive perfume hitting him like a wall. She asked him if he had any idea who she was, her voice rising to a screech that echoed off the high ceilings. She called him a loiterer, a homeless intruder, and a drain on the building's prestige. Kenji didn't flinch. He sat up straighter, his voice regaining a firm, rhythmic clarity. He told her calmly that he had paid for his coffee, he was a patron of the establishment, and he was minding his own business. This lack of fear, this refusal to cower, was the spark that turned her anger into an explosion. Beatrice's eyes landed on the tall, condensation-beaded iced latte sitting on Kenji's table. In one fluid, violent motion, she reached out and snatched the plastic cup. The sound of the liquid hitting Kenji was a wet, heavy thud. The dark coffee drenched his face, soaked into the fabric of his hoodie, and splashed across the keyboard of his laptop. Ice cubes bounced off his forehead and clattered onto the marble floor. Kenji sat perfectly still, the cold liquid dripping from his chin. Around them, the high society crowd froze. Phones were pulled out, not to help, but to capture the spectacle. Beatrice stood over him, her chest heaving, a smug, triumphant smirk playing on her lips. She leaned down until she was inches from his ear, whispering loud enough for the nearest tables to hear that people like him didn't belong in buildings like this. She told him to go back to whatever kitchen he had crawled out of, her voice dripping with a venom that was as old as time itself. The cold coffee dripped from Kenji's chin, but as the liquid hit the floor, the sound seemed to echo back through time, transforming into the rhythmic patter of a leak dripping into a plastic bucket. Suddenly, the pristine marble of the atrium was gone, replaced by the cramped, peeling linoleum of a one-bedroom apartment in Chinatown 20 years ago. The air there didn't smell of expensive roast. It smelled of damp wool, fried ginger, and the metallic tang of old radiator pipes. A young Kenji sat at a small wooden table, his breath visible in the unheated room, watching his father. His father, a man who had been a senior structural engineer in Taipei, was hunched over a stack of legal documents, his hands trembling. The landlord stood in the doorway, a man who didn't bother to take off his muddy boots, shouting about a rent hike that made no sense. Kenji's father tried to explain, his voice soft and hesitant as he searched for the complex English words to describe a breach of contract. But the landlord didn't care about contracts. He laughed, a jagged, ugly sound, and told Kenji's father that if he didn't like the price, he could take his broken English and his family back to the docks. Kenji had watched his father, a man of immense intellect and pride, shrink under that gaze. It was that night, as the radiator hissed and his father sat in the dark to save on electricity, that the lesson was seared into Kenji's soul. To change the world, his father had whispered, you must first own the ground they stand on. Knowledge is the only thing they cannot take from you. While Kenji was spending his teenage years under the hum of a flickering library lamp, mastering calculus and structural integrity on a scholarship, Beatrice Vanderhouse was living a different reality. Miles away, in a sprawling estate in the hills, her father was pouring her a glass of expensive sparkling cider, celebrating another year of inherited status. Her education wasn't about knowledge, it was about leverage. She watched her father navigate the world by stepping over anyone who didn't have a title, learning that an expensive watch and a loud voice could silence the truth. To Beatrice, the world was a ladder, and the only way to stay at the top was to keep her heels firmly planted on the fingers of those climbing up beneath her. Kenji remembered the sting of his first major rejection, years after his father passed away. He had walked into a prestigious firm with a 4.0 GPA and a portfolio that redefined urban sustainability. The hiring manager hadn't even looked at his designs. He had looked at Kenji's modest suit and his last name, then checked his watch. He told Kenji that while his work was adequate, he just didn't fit the corporate culture of the firm. It was a polite, polished way of saying he wasn't one of them. He didn't have the right pedigree. He didn't have the right skin. The memory snapped back to the present as Kenji felt the sticky residue of the latte beginning to dry on his neck. He looked up at Beatrice, who was still preening, basking in the silent approval of her own ego. She saw a man defeated by a cup of coffee, but Kenji was looking at her with a clarity that was almost terrifying. He saw the same landlord from 20 years ago. He saw the hiring manager who had dismissed him. He saw a woman who believed that her white blazer was armor against the consequences of her own cruelty. Kenji slowly reached for a napkin, his movements deliberate and calm. He didn't scream, and he didn't beg. He looked at the shattered screen of his laptop, the machine that held the final renderings for the revitalization of the entire district, and then he looked Beatrice directly in the eyes. His voice was a low, steady rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. He told her that she had made a very expensive mistake. Beatrice just rolled her eyes, scoffing as she checked her reflection in her phone screen once more, completely unaware that the ground she was standing on had already begun to shift. Beatrice didn't just stop at the assault, she wanted an audience for her cruelty. She stepped back, smoothing the lapels of her pristine blazer, and pulled out her latest model smartphone. With a practiced, theatrical flick of her wrist, she began recording. She looked into the camera lens with a fake, wide-eyed expression of terror that would have been impressive if it weren't so sickening. She told her followers that she was being harassed, that a dangerous, unstable man had accosted her in the lobby of the Silver-Tier Plaza. She pointed the camera at Kenji, who was still dripping with coffee, making sure to capture his worn hoodie and the liquid pooling on the table as if it were evidence of his own sloppiness. The heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots on marble signaled the arrival of Officer Miller. Miller was a man whose uniform had seen better days, but his sense of self-importance was freshly pressed. He didn't ask questions. He didn't look at the wet floor or the ruined laptop. He headed straight for Beatrice with a look of practiced deference, his posture softening the moment he recognized her. Beatrice had spent months grooming Miller with $20 tips and accidental leftovers from high-end catering gigs. To Miller, Beatrice was a pillar of the community, and Kenji was a problem to be solved. Beatrice's voice climbed into a frantic, high-pitched register as she pointed a manicured finger at Kenji, demanding that Miller do his job and get this animal out of her sight. She claimed Kenji had tried to grab her purse, that he had lunged at her, and that she had only thrown her drink in self-defense. It was a blatant, ugly lie, uttered with the kind of confidence that only comes from a lifetime of never being held accountable. Miller turned to Kenji, his hand resting heavy on the baton at his belt, and told him to get up. He didn't use Kenji's name, he just called him, son, in a way that felt like a slap. Kenji remained seated for a moment, his eyes moving to the security cameras mounted in the high corners of the atrium. He asked Miller if he was going to check the tapes, if he was going to look at the actual evidence before making an arrest. Miller just scoffed, telling Kenji that he didn't need a tape to see what was going on here. He looked at Kenji's damp clothes and the cracked laptop and told him that he was trespassing in a private facility. He told him he had 10 seconds to clear out or he'd be leaving in handcuffs. The injustice of it was thick in the air, a suffocating heat that made the other patrons look away, suddenly very interested in their own phones. In the shadows near the elevator bank, Sarah, a junior associate from Beatrice's firm, stood paralyzed. She had seen everything from the moment Beatrice tripped. She saw the unprovoked attack, the sneer on Beatrice's face, and the quiet dignity of the man in the hoodie. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew that one word from her could stop this, but she also knew that Beatrice would destroy her career before the sun went down. She watched as Miller grabbed Kenji by the arm, hoisting him up with unnecessary force. Beatrice followed them toward the revolving glass doors, her voice booming through the lobby so everyone would hear. She declared that Kenji was banned, not just from the lounge, but from the entire district. She told him his face would be at every security desk from here to the bay, and that if he ever showed his pathetic, low-class face near her building again, she would make sure he rotted in a cell. She felt powerful, a queen purging her court of a peasant. Kenji stopped just as he reached the threshold of the building. The rain was beginning to fall outside, turning the street into a blurred gray landscape. He didn't struggle against Miller's grip. He turned his head slightly, catching Sarah's eye for a fleeting second. He told her that integrity was a choice, and that she was the only one in the room making the wrong one. Then, with a quiet strength that seemed to unsettle Miller, Kenji shook his arm free and walked out into the downpour. Behind him, Beatrice's laughter rang out, sharp and hollow, as she turned back to the crowd to enjoy her victory, completely unaware that she had just signed the death warrant for her own career. The cold rain of the city drummed a relentless rhythm against the rusted metal of the bus stop shelter, a stark contrast to the climate-controlled perfection of the atrium Kenji had just been forced to leave. He sat on a damp wooden bench, the smell of wet wool and exhaust fumes clinging to him. Water dripped from his hair onto the keyboard of his ruined laptop. To any passerby, he was the picture of a broken man, a victim of a system that favored the loud and the wealthy. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone that was far newer and more sophisticated than his clothes suggested. He dialed a number that wasn't in any public directory. The voice that answered was deep and authoritative, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who sat behind a mahogany desk in the Capitol. Kenji told him that it was over, that he had been kicked out, and that the deal was effectively dead. He spoke with a hollow tone, letting the disappointment hang in the air like the fog rolling off the bay. The official on the other end sounded frantic, reminding Kenji that if he couldn't even gain access to the building, there was no way the $500 million revitalization grant could be signed by the end of the week. But as the official spoke, Kenji's expression began to change. The slump in his shoulders vanished, and his eyes, which had been downcast and tired, suddenly sharpened with a cold, predatory intelligence. He wasn't just an architect, and he wasn't just a worker. Kenji Chen was the silent primary investor behind the New Horizon project, a massive holding company that had spent the last 18 months quietly acquiring every major property in the district. He didn't just want to design the building, he had decided to own the ground beneath Beatrice's feet. Kenji reached into the small, hidden pocket of his hoodie and pulled out a tiny, high-fidelity recording device. He pressed play, and the sounds of the lobby filled the small space of the bus stop. Beatrice's shrill laughter, the wet slap of the drink hitting his face, the racial slurs she had hissed under her breath, and Officer Miller's blatant refusal to check the security tapes. It was all there, clear, undeniable, and devastating. He hadn't been a victim in that lobby, he had been a witness, collecting every piece of rope Beatrice was using to hang herself. His mindset shifted in an instant. The victim persona fell away like a discarded skin, replaced by the planner. He realized that Beatrice hadn't just insulted a stranger, she had handed him the perfect legal and ethical lever to dismantle her entire career. In the eyes of the law, it was battery and defamation. In the eyes of his corporation, it was a breach of the moral turpitude clause in her firm's lease agreement. He checked his watch, a high-end piece of engineering he had kept hidden under his sleeve. Instead of reacting with the hot, impulsive anger Beatrice expected, Kenji began to play the long game. He looked at the stained blueprints in his bag and smiled a thin, dangerous smile. He knew something Beatrice didn't. The transfer of the Silver-Tier Plaza's title to his holding company had been finalized at exactly 2 o'clock that afternoon, while she was busy bragging to her followers about her victory. He wasn't the intruder anymore. He was the landlord. He leaned back against the cold metal of the shelter, ignoring the rain, and began to dial his legal team. The trash she had tried to throw away was about to become the person who decided whether or not she had a roof over her head. The transformation began in a sleek, glass-walled command center overlooking the city's shimmering skyline, a world away from the damp bus stop. Kenji stood by the window, the reflection of the city lights dancing in his eyes. He had shed the soaked, coffee-stained hoodie like a heavy weight from the past. In its place was a midnight blue, bespoke Italian suit that fit his frame with military precision. His movements were no longer hesitant or tired, they were the movements of a man who moved mountains with a single phone call. He stood with his hands behind his back, watching the tiny headlights of cars thousands of feet below, while 3 of the city's most expensive attorneys sat at the conference table behind him, their laptops glowing in the dim light. The air in the room was thick with the silent focus of a hunt. One lawyer scrolled through the digital files provided by Sarah, the junior associate who had finally chosen a side. The files were devastating. They showed that Beatrice's marketing firm hadn't just been arrogant, they had been desperate. They were 6 months behind on their specialized lease agreement, a fact Beatrice had buried under a mountain of forged spreadsheets and false promises to her board of directors. Kenji listened as his lead counsel detailed the notice of immediate eviction and the civil suit for battery and defamation. They weren't just going to ask her to leave, they were going to legally erase her presence from the district. While Kenji worked in the shadows of power, Beatrice was basking in the glow of a very different light. She sat at a corner table in the city's most exclusive rooftop bar, the sound of clinking crystal and vapid laughter surrounding her. She held her phone up, showing her friends the edited video of the incident. She laughed as she watched Kenji being doused in coffee, narrating the moment with a sneer, telling her friends how she had sanitized the lobby for the good of the building. She was drinking a $100 glass of champagne, toasted by her peers as a hero who stood up to the unwashed masses. She felt invincible, convinced that the man she had humiliated was currently shivering in some alleyway, forgotten by the world. But beneath the surface of her digital triumph, the tide was already turning. In the comments section of her viral post, the narrative was crumbling. A few onlookers who had filmed from different angles were posting the unedited footage. People were starting to see the aggressive way she had lunged, the racial slurs she had hissed, and the cold, unprovoked nature of the attack. Beatrice saw the notifications, the angry emojis, and the calls for her firing, but she simply tapped delete with a manicured thumb. She believed she could curate reality just as easily as she curated her photos. She had no idea that the trash she thought she had discarded was currently reviewing the final transfer of the building's title. Kenji walked over to the conference table and picked up his old, ruined laptop. The screen was black, a spiderweb of cracks running through the glass where the coffee had seeped into the hardware. He didn't look at it with sadness. He looked at it as a relic. He instructed his assistant to have the laptop placed in a custom-made glass display case. He wanted it at the meeting the next morning. It wasn't just a broken computer anymore, it was the cornerstone of the new Silver-Tier Plaza. He spent the rest of the night in quiet, methodical preparation. He sent out a mandatory, high-priority email to every tenant in the building, including Beatrice's firm. The subject line was simple: Emergency Building Ownership Briefing 9 a.m. He knew Beatrice would show up. Her ego wouldn't allow her to miss a chance to rub elbows with the mysterious new owners. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the city in shades of gold and violet, Kenji closed his eyes for a brief moment of reflection. He thought of his father's trembling hands and the landlord's muddy boots. The trap was set, the steel was forged, and the sun was rising on the last day of Beatrice Vanderhaus's reign. The Pearl Atrium had been transformed overnight into a stage for a high-stakes drama, though only one person in the room knew the script. Velvet ropes lined the perimeter, and a small, elegant podium had been erected exactly where the coffee had splashed the day before. The air was charged with a heavy, electric anticipation. Local news crews hovered near the back, and the city's most influential business owners huddled in small groups, whispering about the mysterious, New Horizon project that had just swallowed the Silver-Tier Plaza in a single afternoon. Beatrice Vanderhaus arrived exactly 5 minutes late, a deliberate move to ensure all eyes were on her. She looked radiant in a sharp, blood-red power suit, her blonde hair pulled back into a tight, ruthless bun. She moved through the crowd with an insufferable smirk, nodding to acquaintances as if she were already the hostess of the building. She spotted Officer Miller near the entrance, his uniform crisply pressed, standing guard with a smug look of pride. He tipped his cap to her, and she rewarded him with a condescending wink. She felt untouchable. In her mind, the new owners were likely people just like her, people who valued order, status, and the removal of anyone who didn't fit the brand. Deep in the crowd, Sarah stood clutching a manila folder to her chest, her knuckles white. She looked like she hadn't slept, her eyes darting toward the stage and then back to Beatrice. She knew the contents of the folder were a career-ending bomb, and the weight of the secret was making it hard for her to breathe. She watched as Beatrice approached a man standing near the podium. The man had his back to the room, looking out at the marble floor. He was wearing a midnight blue suit that draped perfectly over his shoulders, his presence commanding even without saying a word. Beatrice didn't recognize the suit, but she recognized the opportunity. She stepped up behind him, her voice loud enough to be heard by those standing nearby, dripping with her signature brand of haughty humor. She leaned in and told him she hoped he was there to finally clean up the mess from yesterday, claiming it still smelled like cheap coffee and unwashed loiterers. She laughed, a sharp, grating sound, and waited for the man to turn around and join in on the joke. The man didn't laugh. He turned slowly, his movements deliberate and heavy with authority. As his face came into the light, the laughter died in Beatrice's throat. She blinked, her jaw tightening as she stared at Kenji Chen. But this wasn't the tired, coffee-stained man in the hoodie she had humiliated. This was someone else. His eyes were cold, piercing, and filled with a quiet, terrifying power. Beatrice let out a nervous, mocking snort, trying to regain her footing. She called out for Miller, shouting for the guard to come and remove the intruder, who had somehow managed to steal a decent suit. Miller moved forward, his hand reaching for his handcuffs, his face twisted in a sneer. But before he could take another step, the CEO of the building's former property management group stepped onto the stage. He didn't look at Beatrice. He looked directly at Kenji and bowed his head slightly. The CEO's voice boomed through the speakers, silencing every whisper in the atrium. He told Officer Miller to stand down immediately. He told the entire room to pay attention. Then, he delivered the words that turned the blood in Beatrice's veins to ice. He announced that they were all standing in the presence of the new chairman of the board and the sole owner of the Silver-Tier Plaza. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes a total collapse. Beatrice stood frozen, her hand still raised as if to point a finger, but her arm had gone limp. She looked at Kenji, then at the CEO, then back to Kenji's unshakable, stony expression. The gold key card in Kenji's hand glinted under the high-intensity lights of the lobby. The crowd began to murmur, the realization rippling through the room like a shockwave. The man she had treated like garbage, the man she had splashed with coffee and tried to banish from the streets, didn't just belong in the building. He owned every single brick, every pane of glass, and every lease, including hers. Kenji stepped onto the small stage, the rhythmic thud of his shoes on the wood sounding like the beating of a drum. He reached for the microphone, but his eyes never left Beatrice's face. The arrogance that had defined her features just moments ago had collapsed into a frantic, twitching mess of confusion. Behind him, the massive LED screens that usually displayed stock market tickers and weather updates suddenly flickered and changed. A grainy but crystal clear video began to play. It was the unedited footage of the lobby from the day before. The entire room watched in a haunting silence as Beatrice's voice boomed through the high-definition speakers, her racial slurs and her shrill, unprovoked screams echoing off the marble walls. The footage showed her lunging forward, the deliberate arc of the coffee cup, and the splash hitting Kenji's face. Kenji began to speak, his voice no longer the quiet, tired murmur of a man in a hoodie. It was deep, resonant, and carried the weight of a person who had spent 20 years building a kingdom. He looked out at the sea of faces and told them that yesterday, a woman had stood in this very spot and decided that he didn't belong. He told them how she had called him an animal, how she had tried to erase his dignity because she thought he was powerless. He turned back to Beatrice, who was trembling so hard her heels were clicking against the stone. He said his name was Kenji Chen, and he didn't just belong in this building, he had designed its future. Beatrice tried to speak, her voice coming out in a thin, desperate wheeze. She began to backpedal, her hands fluttering in front of her as she claimed it was just a stressful day, that she had been under immense pressure, and that she had never meant for things to go so far. She even tried to offer a shaky, forced smile, reaching out a hand to touch Kenji's sleeve as if they were old friends who had just had a minor misunderstanding. Kenji stepped back, his eyes flashing with a cold fire. He told her that she wasn't apologizing to the man she had assaulted. He told her she was only apologizing to the man who signed her lease. He looked her directly in the eye and said that if she weren't sorry for the action, she wasn't sorry at all, she was just terrified of the consequence. The air in the atrium seemed to thin as Kenji pulled a set of legal documents from the podium. He announced that as of 9:05 that morning, Beatrice's marketing firm was being evicted for a total breach of the moral turpitude clause. He told her she had precisely 1 hour to vacate the premises before her belongings were moved to the sidewalk. Then, he turned his gaze to Officer Miller, who was trying to blend into the shadows near the entrance. Kenji didn't raise his voice. He simply informed Miller that he was fired, and that his legal team had already handed over a mountain of evidence to the district attorney regarding the falsification of a police report. The crowd erupted. It wasn't a roar of anger, but a wave of shocked, satisfying realization. Sarah stepped out from the wings, her face pale but her chin held high, and handed Kenji the manila folder containing the proof of Beatrice's financial crimes. Kenji took the folder and looked at Sarah with a small, knowing nod. He told her that integrity looked good on her, and in front of everyone, he named her the acting director of the entire plaza's marketing operations. Beatrice, now completely broken, began to sob, her designer blazer suddenly looking like a cheap costume. As the new security team moved in to escort her toward the doors, Kenji delivered the final blow. He told her that she had once said he was banned forever. It turned out, he said, that the only thing banned in his building was her. The chaos of the morning eventually faded into a quiet, orderly hum, but the world outside the Silver-Tier Plaza was just beginning to burn with the story. Beatrice Vanderhouse stood on the sidewalk, the same pavement where she had once laughed as Kenji was forced into the rain. Now, she was the one shivering. Her designer heels were scuffed, and she clutched a soggy cardboard box containing a few framed awards and a desk plant that was already wilting. The news crews she had once courted were now a swarm of predators, their cameras flashing like strobe lights as they shouted questions about her, viral racism, and the fraud charges looming over her head. She looked small, her power stripped away like cheap gold plating, leaving only the tarnished reality beneath. She had become a ghost in the very district she claimed to rule, a cautionary tale whispered in the elevators of every high-rise in the city. Inside the atrium, the atmosphere had shifted from one of exclusive tension to a warm, vibrant energy. Kenji sat at the same corner booth where the storm had started, but the table was no longer stained with coffee. He watched as Marcus, the young barista, moved with a new sense of purpose. Kenji had stayed true to his word, investing in the cafe and ensuring every employee received a living wage and full benefits. He didn't just want to own the building, he wanted to change the culture of the ground it stood on. He looked at the glass display case near the entrance, where his ruined, coffee-stained laptop sat as a permanent installation. It served as a silent reminder to everyone who entered that the most brilliant minds often come in the most humble packages. 5 years passed with the steady, relentless march of time. The Silver-Tier Plaza had been renamed the Chen International Center, a global hub for sustainable architecture and immigrant-led startups. One brisk autumn afternoon, Kenji walked through the lobby, holding the hand of his 7-year-old daughter. He was no longer the man in the hoodie, but he still wore a simple sweater and comfortable shoes, his wealth an invisible foundation rather than a loud statement. As they moved toward the exit, his daughter tripped over a stray broom handle. A woman in a bright neon orange vest, her face weathered by the sun and hands calloused from hard labor, hurried over to apologize. The woman paused as she looked up, her eyes meeting Kenji's. It was Beatrice. The red power suit was long gone, replaced by the heavy fabric of a city sanitation uniform. She didn't have a smartphone in her hand or a sneer on her lips. Instead, she looked at the child with a soft, weary kindness. She gently picked up the girl's fallen teddy bear, brushed off the dust, and handed it back with a humble smile. There was no recognition of Kenji as her enemy, only as a father. She had spent 5 years working the very streets she used to look down upon, and in that time, the concrete had taught her the lessons that champagne never could. She had finally learned that every person, regardless of their clothes or their job, carried a weight she knew nothing about. Kenji watched her walk away to continue her shift, a profound sense of peace settling in his chest. He realized that true justice wasn't just about the fall of a villain, it was about the slow, quiet birth of a better human being. He squeezed his daughter's hand and looked up at the glass towers reflecting the afternoon sun. He thought of his father's Taipei engineering degree and the cold Chinatown apartment, realizing that the legacy he had built wasn't made of steel and marble, but of the dignity he had refused to let anyone take away. The lesson was simple, yet it carried the weight of a lifetime. The clothes we wear and the titles we carry are nothing more than the cover of a book, a temporary wrapping that can be torn away by a single turn of fate. You must never judge the heart of a person by the surface they show the world, for the stranger you humiliate today might be the one who holds the keys to your future tomorrow. Kindness costs nothing, but its absence can cost you everything you've ever built. In the end, we are all just walking each other home, and the ground we stand on belongs to no one but the truth.